this edition of 2020 Daily Trail Markers, entrepreneur and Democratic presidential candidate Andrew Yang promised a big fundraising haul for the third quarter. He teased the numbers at a rally in Los Angeles Monday night.
We're about to close out Q3, and we've got some news for the world. Because they're looking up, they're saying, hey, Andrew Yang, his campaign, really interesting, raised $2.8 million in Q2. We're about to blow that figure out of the water. We raised $2 million in the last week alone.
So on Wednesday, Andrew Yang's campaign announced a third quarter fundraising haul of $10 million. That's more than 3 times the amount he brought in for quarter 2. Yang celebrated the numbers on Twitter, saying, quote, other campaigns are plateauing or contracting while we are growing quickly. Our rate of growth makes all things possible, including our winning the general election next year. Ben Mitchell is an associate producer in the CBS News political unit. He has been following Andrew Yang's presidential campaign. Ben, thank you so much for being with us. This is such a fascinating dynamic unfolding to me with Andrew Yang's campaign. First of all, break down the $10 million for us. What did these donations actually look like?
So according to the campaign, they raised an average of about $30 per donation. And they also said that of that $10 million, about 80% of that was from online donors who gave less than $200. So what you're looking at is a pretty effective small dollar grassroots fundraising base that they've cultivated and grown. Like you said, it's tripled since the second quarter, so that's no small feat.
Interesting. And with those numbers in mind, give us some context. How does Andrew Yang stack up against the other Democrats running for president?
Well, we still don't have everybody's fundraising numbers yet, but from what we've seen so far, he has managed to out-fundraise some of the sitting U.S. senators that are running for office. And he came within striking distance of Senator Kamala Harris. She managed to fundraise about $11.6 million. He had $10 million. But it's important to note he didn't, quite break through. He didn't quite knock off Senator Harris. But context is key. He is a first-time political candidate. He had little to no name recognition coming in, and compared to some of these other candidates that had fundraising lists in place, he's basically had to build his from scratch, and he still managed to get to a 10 million mark. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah, and what have you learned about how Andrew Yang's campaign is actually going to be spending that money?
Well, they've already started doing some substantial investment in the early states. They've opened some new campaign offices. They are adding full-time staffers. They're training volunteers in these caucus states where you need to have people that sort of understand how the caucus process works. And he told me when I spoke to him in Iowa a couple weeks ago that he is going to be making investments not just in traditional infrastructure, but in new technologies for 2019 and 2020 to compete nationally. And I've spoken to some digital strategists that say that he has a pretty good digital team. And so what I'm interested in seeing is what they managed to do with that money on the digital side. How to keep growing that list, how to keep fundraising. So it'll be interesting to see what they do going forward.
Yeah, because I know his supporters, the Yang Gang, as they call themselves, they're pretty active on social media from what we've seen. So let's talk about the upcoming debates. Yang is already qualified to participate in the Democratic debate on October 15th. There's another debate in November, but the actual qualifications are going to change. Remind us, what are the requirements going to be for that?
So the donor threshold is 165,000 unique donors, and the Yang campaign says they've already blown past that mark. But what gets interesting is there's actually 2 polling qualifications. You can get 3% in 4 of the early state or national polls, or you can get 5% in 2 of the early state polls. He's already gotten 3 of those 4 early state and national polls. He only needs 1 more to make the debate. There's plenty of polling that's happening between now and then, so it's good to keep an eye on those polls as they come out, because you might see his name and he might cross that mark.
Yeah, so we know that central to his campaign is this proposal for a universal basic income, $1,000 a month, what he calls the freedom dividend. His campaign is already giving 10 families a chance to experience what life under the UBI program would be like. And our Nicole Skanga, who's a CBS News campaign reporter, spoke to one family in New Hampshire that has actually already been receiving the freedom dividend, as he calls it, since January. Let's go ahead and take a listen to some of that.
A universal basic income will give them the ability to survive, have the money if they're struggling with car payments, or if they're struggling with car repairs, or if they're struggling with rent and being able to afford rent, or if they're struggling. It's money that could be spent where it's needed to be spent individually, as opposed to a gift card to I don't know, university. It's like, oh, great, here's a gift card to Harvard. Well, I can't afford the rest of the tuition. This is only for half, so it doesn't do me any good. If you gave cash, then you can choose where the money goes. It's more about, the government feels like they know best, and we're going to give you help, but it's going to be the help that we feel you need, as opposed to what do you need for help and how can we help you with that.
So Yang's campaign said over 450,000 people signed up for a chance to participate in his Freedom Dividend program. What is unclear, or is it clear, whether or not that actually is going to translate when it comes to votes?
Well, it did translate to donations. Yeah. Part of this big fundraising push, they announced a few days after he announced that pilot program at the last debate that they raised more than $1 million in just a very short amount of time. So clearly, it brought interest to the Yang campaign. Sure. He hasn't seen a substantial polling increase, but there's still time. I do think, though, that he needs to, there's other voters that or other issues that matter to Democratic voters. Sure. And to get a plurality of them, he needs to meet those voters where they live on the issues they care about. So I think UBI gets their attention, but there's other issues that matter to voters, and if he engages them on that front, you might see a more substantial polling increase.
So we know that the impeachment inquiry really has been sort of dominating the news cycle. What is the Yang campaign strategy for sort of bringing some of the spotlight back to Andrew Yang himself?
Well, they've been doing a lot of traveling, and they're always traveling. They were in New Hampshire, then they were in California at that big rally. Thousands of people came to see him. Now they're in Nevada for the various campaign events, meeting supporters, participating in the gun forum, and so they're traveling and they're engaging voters in the meantime, while the national media may be sort of caught up in the impeachment story. But this is where that $6.3 million that he still has on hand will come in handy. This is the time when you need to use that money to knock on doors and talk to voters and keep engaging them at the grassroots level. And so I think we can expect, as they expand in these early states, to engage in some of that behavior and really try to make sure their voters are staying engaged with them.
Yeah, well, he's a numbers guy. It'll be interesting to see where his numbers go from here. Ben Mitchell, great to have you here. Thank you so much, Ben.
Thank you, Elaine.